Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining in. We have Paula Courtney here with us tonight, and she is going to be talking about developing and implementing a biosecurity program for your Rabbitry. As everybody knows, Paula is a rabbit breeder. She's been breeding for a really long time. She is also an ARBA judge, judge number 965. But more importantly to that, for the topic tonight, she also is in the animal health sector in her professional career, where she is the director of animal health for Sterilex. So she also creates a lot of biosecurity plans for poultry and swine producers in her professional career. So I'll turn it over to Paula, and thank you, Paula, for doing this.
Yeah, thanks, David, for having me. Hi, everyone. As David said, I'm going to be talking about developing and implementing a biosecurity program for your Rabbitry. I'm the director of animal health for a sanitation chemical company called Sterilex. And so we do a lot of biosecurity training and work with a lot of poultry and swine producers on sanitation in general. So I've added some of that information in the presentation, and there's a lot to cover. Biosecurity is a pretty big topic, and so I'll jump right into it and get started. So first, I'll talk a little bit about what biosecurity is, and more importantly, why we care, some things that are currently happening in the industry, talk about some misconceptions, really dig into doing risk assessments at your facility and what that means as it pertains to starting to develop a program. We'll talk a little bit about some of the key areas of biosecurity, including entryway control, cleaning and disinfection, rodent control, insect control, water quality, and then we'll get into some best practices and resources. And I believe there should be some time at the end for questions. So a very simple definition of biosecurity is a series of management practices designed to prevent the introduction and spread of disease agents. So this definitely pertains to diseases that are going to affect animal health in our rabbits, but it can also be food safety pathogens as well. Whenever I do biosecurity trainings, I like to get people in the mindset of thinking about it as building blocks or layers. And so these are the NPIP biosecurity principles. And so that's the National Poultry Program biosecurity principles and areas that they've identified in biosecurity programs that the industry is being audited on. So you can see some of these areas that are listed here in these blocks are going to pertain to us in rabbits a little bit more than others, but there's a lot of parallels that we can draw and a lot of things that we can learn from what the poultry industry has implemented in response to avian influenza outbreaks that they deal with every couple of years. So we're looking at this, and we got this kind of lined out as building blocks, and all the different areas of the program are important. And really the way that we want to think about this is if we ignore one specific area of the program, or we have a weakness in that foundation that we've laid out, what happens? Well, then the program can collapse. And so in that scenario, we might deal with different disease outbreaks. RHDV2 is obviously front of mind right now for us, but we also deal with other diseases in the industry, and we deal with Pasteurella and E. coli as well. And so really trying to lay out a solid foundation to try and prevent these types of scenarios. So that ties right into why do we care about biosecurity? Obviously, I am not a microbiologist and I'm not a veterinarian, but we are dealing with a situation right now in the US where we've got RHDV2 outbreaks and in both domestic and wild rabbit populations throughout the Southwest. And so we're really looking as an industry overall, how can we improve our management practices moving forward to try to prevent the spread and outbreak of this disease in future years and in our current situation. So I'll be going into a lot of different ideas pertaining to how we can start to build out biosecurity programs. As far as the actual virus itself, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. There's a lot of information out there on the USDA website where you can learn more about very specifics of this virus, but I'll be focusing mostly on how it pertains to implementing a biosecurity program. So with that, the key highlights about RHDV2 are that it is highly contagious, and it is non-enveloped, and it's in the calicivirus family. It is pretty difficult to inactivate. We'll get into that a little bit more, but it is a bit hardier than coronavirus, for example. So there is a lot of information on social media lately. There's a lot of different Facebook groups out there, a lot of challenges and misconceptions. And so I'm hoping to address some of these, you know, some of the negativity or misconceptions that I've seen lately on social media as it pertains to biosecurity and RHDV2. You know, a lot of people are in the mindset that they can't afford to implement a biosecurity program because it's too expensive. It's not worth it because if you can't kill every fly or every rat on your property, then it's pointless to invest anything into a program. I've heard people talk about foot baths, and they don't actually work unless you stand in them for 10 minutes. Then, you know, there's kind of the opposite side of the spectrum where there's the group of people who think that, you know, the virus is not going to affect them. It's not going to affect their herd. They're kind of in denial about it almost. And then there's people who are almost in a paralysis mode where they're so overwhelmed that they think the world's ending and they don't know where to get started. So hopefully I can address some of these misconceptions or challenges within the presentation. I'm hoping to get to each and every one of these points. But really, if we start to think about this, the reality is that this is what we're dealing with. It's probably not going to go away completely. So the threat is here and it's probably here to stay. But we're all in this together, and everyone can make some small changes and implement some small procedures to really start to make a difference in our overall ability to control any outbreaks that happen in the future. So one way that we've described biosecurity, and I hear this a lot, is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so I think as we start to talk about biosecurity in rabbits and how this is kind of a new topic that we've never implemented before, everyone really needs to sit down and take a moment to reflect and understand what their herd means to them, what their rabbits mean to them, what level of risk they're willing to assume when it comes to that herd of rabbits, and how that relates to how much money they're willing to budget or can afford to spend on prevention, right? So how much are we willing to put forth towards prevention versus what would it cost us to, what would the cost be to us if we potentially lost our herd to a virus such as RHDV? So I think everyone needs to really understand what their limits are and kind of sit down and take a moment to reflect on that, because it is going to affect what you're implementing and how much you can do and the level of risk that you're willing to assume as you start to put together your program. So going along with that in risk assessments, you know, one of the first slides I showed those building blocks and the NPIP principles. So again, you know, there we're looking at a biosecurity program as building blocks. I've also described it as an onion where there's a lot of different layers, and each additional layer that you add on is going to give you an added level of protection. So you're thinking about this as how many steps can I implement that are actually realistic, that I'm going to follow on a regular basis, and what's going to be practical as far as how much I can afford and what I'm actually going to comply with. So the more that you can do, the more that you're going to limit your risk of a disease outbreak at your facility. But the key here is that biosecurity is not a silver bullet. There is never a guarantee. Even if you're doing every single thing right that you possibly can, there's still obviously a chance that you could break with disease. But it's all about reducing your risk and limiting that risk that you're going to break with disease. So the more you can do, the better off you're going to be. All of these different blocks shown here on this slide are different levels of security that you can add to your program. So obviously not everybody has enclosed buildings. That's not necessarily how we're raising rabbits everywhere in the US. But if you have an enclosed building, you're one step more protected. If you can have a foot bath at your entryway, if you can have a footwear change where you have footwear that you're only wearing inside your barn and you're having separate footwear that you're going to wear outside. Having hand sanitizer stations or a bottle of hand sanitizer that you use as you enter into your barn and when you leave. If you have disinfection steps for equipment going into your barn, if you have proper cleaning and disinfection procedures and rodent and insect control programs, all of these different levels and layers that you can add to your biosecurity program are going to reduce your level of risk that you're assuming. So again, being realistic with ourselves, understanding what your goals and expectations are going to help you to design the best program for your facility and your situation. So when I started thinking about how the poultry industry designs biosecurity and how we can think of cost-effective ways to start implementing this into rabbits so that everybody can really start to make some changes. I think about Smokey the Bear and how he tells you about the fire risk that you've got at any given point in time throughout the year. And so that risk is going to change depending on different factors, right? And sometimes it's low and he'll have a little green symbol, and sometimes it's moderate risk and sometimes it's very high. And so we can really take these ideas and start to use this to help structure a biosecurity program that's going to have different layers to it depending on what the risk is at any given time based on our assessment. And so when we apply this into structuring a program, I put together this flow chart to kind of help us assess the risk and how that's going to relate into a low, moderate, and high risk scenario and different levels and tiers per se of a biosecurity program. So the different factors, and this is all based on really my opinion, some of the ARBA guidelines have been worked into this flow chart, but I put this together as strictly a starting point. Everyone really needs to decide for themselves what is going to put you into a low risk, moderate risk, or high risk level. But this should give some guidance of what factors are going to affect where you're falling at any given time throughout the year. So season does play a part. Historically, if we look at other countries, the virus is really going to peak during breeding season. And so spring and summer are going to be the highest risk time for us here in the US when wild rabbit populations are having more contact and it's breeding season. Obviously, any type of disease can spread more rapidly. Other factors that you're going to consider are if RHDV2 has been confirmed in your state in the past 60 days. If it has, that's going to potentially put you into a different risk tier than if it hasn't yet been confirmed in your state at all. If it's show season and your animals or you as a person or equipment that you're taking into a show are going to have contact with a lot of different rabbits from different areas, that's obviously going to put you in a higher risk tier than if you're staying home. If you are within 150 miles of an active outbreak, that's definitely going to affect whether you're potentially in a moderate or a high risk category. And if that outbreak is in wild rabbit populations or domestic rabbit populations, and this really does make a difference because when we think about domestic rabbit herd that broke with RHDV2, that herd can be isolated, quarantined, euthanized in a lot of scenarios and properly disposed of versus a wild rabbit population. We have a lot less control about how far that virus spreads when it's out in wild rabbits. So all those factors are really going to affect where you're going to fall into these different tiers. And it's up for all of us to have a good understanding of where we're at and what level we're going to be at in our program throughout the year. So moving that into starting to build out a program, and I'm going to go into more detail in a lot of these important biosecurity areas later in the presentation. And I'm not going to go through and walk everyone through writing out a full biosecurity program by any means, but these are just some ideas to really help people get started. And there are some resources at the end of the presentation where I've provided some templates that are available online where it actually helps you helps poultry producers write out a full biosecurity program, and we can utilize those tools to really as a basis for developing our own. And so when I'm looking at a level 1, a level 2, and a level 3 of risk, the first things that I really want to start to implement in this low risk area are that I think everyone needs to have entryway control, and I can't emphasize enough how important this is, and I'm going to go into a lot of detail about what that means. Insect control programs and rodent control programs, and I'm already doing those and have been at my property, but I think everyone should do that, not just from a biosecurity standpoint, but sanitation in general. We need to be mindful of insects and rodents that are on our properties and in our rabbitries. Boot covers for visitors potentially is a really good idea, and starting to think about having a quarantine area for any new replacement stock you're bringing in, but also any rabbits that might be leaving the facility and coming back, such as going to shows. So those are all some considerations to start to think about in that lower budget, less expensive level 1 low risk category. And those are things that everyone can start to implement. When we start to get into level 2, all of your level 1 measurements will start to get heightened a little bit. You might add some additional sanitization measures for all our items that are entering into your barn. You might actually implement boot change program or boot covers for yourself, your family. You're going to limit your visitors. Think about water sanitization, or at least think about what your water source is and how you're providing that to your animals. And then when we get into this level 3 high risk, it can get a bit more expensive. But right, it's all about what you're willing to spend to reduce the risk to your herd and what your herd is worth to you. And so all of these items that are on here are going to be in addition to what we've already mentioned in the first 2 tiers, but you're starting to be more conscious about vehicle washes, disinfecting your vehicle potentially. If you're going anywhere where if you're driving across where wild rabbits might have been and then driving down to your barn potentially, you're thinking more about any additional measures to enclose your building, seal it up, maybe potentially you're even doing clothing changes or wearing coveralls in your barn, and you would have absolutely no visitors if you were in a level 3 high risk. So I'm getting ready to start to dive into entryway control like we mentioned already. But first I want to go over the definitions of 2 important biosecurity lines that are a part of every biosecurity program. A lot of people might have heard of these before, but the first one is a perimeter buffer area, and that's shown in the photo on the right. So the yellow line that's surrounding this property. And obviously our rabbitries in general are not going to be as large as this chicken farm, but you can see that it kind of follows along the property line. At your house, maybe it's just your backyard or area surrounding the actual rabbitry. It can be whatever you want it to be, but having an understanding of where that line is and when your biosecurity measures are going to start to come into effect, because that is kind of where they start and it's your first line of defense. So the second line, and this one is extremely important, is the line of separation. And this is known as the last line of defense between the outside and where your rabbits are. And so your biosecurity measures when it comes to entryway control are going to be the most strict and stringent in that area. You're going to have the most layers focused around that line of separation. And there are a lot of different products out in the market. I had seen some people ask some pre-questions about what to use in a biosecurity program and where you can get that. So I tried to incorporate some of that information into the program or into this presentation. So these are a lot of products that I use. I work for a chemical manufacturer, but I use a lot of different products in my program, and it's all about using what's going to work best for your facility, what's going to work for your budget, and what is going to be the easiest, most practical for you to implement, where you're not going to skip it or other members of the family aren't going to skip it, and something that anyone going into your facility, including your hired help, is also going to be able to comply with. So we'll talk a little bit about different application equipment for entryway control, but there's all different forms of products. I'm showing here an aerosol can, an aerosol spray where you literally spray the bottom of your boots as you walk in. There's wipes available on the market. You can wipe down your cell phone or anything else you need to bring into the barn with you or into the Rabbitry. We're all familiar with hand sanitizer. It's getting a bit easier to get a hold of now, and so that's very helpful, but can't stress enough the use of hand sanitizer on a regular basis. You might even want to wear gloves in your Rabbitry in certain scenarios, maybe when you get to the high risk level. There's also tablet products out there. This Virkon S in general is available. A lot of people are buying it in powder form. I really like these tablets because it's very easy to correctly dilute it in the right amount of water without having to actually measure anything out. And so, you know, you're just putting 8 tabs in a gallon or 4 tabs in a half a gallon, and that's the correct dilution that we would want to use it at for any type of equipment or potentially footwear. And then there's other products that are also in powder form, and those can be super useful. They're a little bit easier to manage, powder in a foot pan, for example, than liquids. And we'll talk about that more in some of the future slides. So this is a diagram of a Danish entry system, and these are really commonly used in poultry and swine. Basically, the key here is that you've got a dirty side and a clean side, and your line of separation is in the middle. And often there's a physical barrier, ideally, on that line of separation. So it really makes somebody stop and think and potentially have to sit down on a bench and swing their legs over to get to the clean side and change their footwear. But at bare minimum, there is a definite line distinguishing the clean side from the dirty side, and we're respecting the fact that there are biosecurity measures and layers happening as you enter into the dirty side and before you get to the clean side. And so this is a very, very simple, inexpensive way that we can all start to think about how we're entering into our Rabbitry and what type of pathogens or virus we might be carrying as we walk across our yard or areas where wild rabbits also have access. So I'll show some practical examples of this. This is actually my barn, and so I wanted to show this photo because when RHDV2 was first confirmed in Texas, this is something I put together very, very quickly and implemented just so that I had some type of protection. And I've actually got several products in this photo and different layers of protection. But you can see there's a Rubbermaid container there on the dirty side, which is something that I could keep potentially a change of footwear in and not have to worry about spiders getting in there, things like that, because I am in the South. But then I've got this nice shelving unit here with wipes on it, hand sanitizer. I've got aerosol disinfectant for my footwear. I've got a shoe change, and I have a powdered foot pan. So, you know, the more layers that you can put together, the more effective your program is going to be. And so just trying to show a practical example of something that I threw together that was relatively inexpensive. Yes, that is just duct tape on the floor, but it definitely is something that everyone, I think, can start to implement. These are some additional examples of what this can look like as far as entryways. And you know, that's me in the middle spraying my footwear. Rubber boots like that are really handy because you can disinfect them and they work really well. Not always practical when it's very hot out, but These two side photos are actually from poultry facilities. And so I like this one here that says stop, because it's just a reminder that, you know, it's not just always one person that's going into the rabbitry. And so sometimes, you know, if we've got a family, you do need to make sure that everyone is paying attention and being mindful of any type of biosecurity practices that you're implementing. And then this first picture here on the left is nice because it shows that physical barrier or that bench. But it also has the Rubbermaid containers there with the footwear change. You can also include Tyvek suits or coveralls or anything else that you might want to implement. I think in rabbits, those are more of a high risk level is when you would start to implement those types of things. So for entryway control, we usually are using some different tools. The aerosol cans, spray cans are nice with the disinfectant because you don't need to pre-mix anything. I really am an advocate for those in these scenarios because I think it's an easy way to start to implement biosecurity if you're not necessarily super used to doing anything in the past. I've seen a lot of people posting on Facebook these mats that you kind of soak with liquid disinfectants. And then I've also seen a lot of people recommending to put bleach into a foot bath. So it'll be a liquid foot bath. I have a couple comments on that because we do see it in the industry a lot, and poultry industry especially has started to move away from that for a couple of different reasons. But certain chemical classes perform better or worse in the presence of organic matter. And that's a whole topic in its own, is different types of chemical classes and how they interact in different scenarios in live production especially. But I will say that bleach is one that gets rapidly bound up in presence of organic matter. And so if you start to put bleach or certain other products into a liquid foot bath and you're walking through it and have manure or dirt on your footwear, that foot bath is going to become ineffective extremely rapidly, where you would need to be changing it at least once a day and ideally every time somebody walked through it. And I think when you're starting to implement a biosecurity program for the first time, that's not very practical because it's going to be very hard to remember to continuously do that to be effective. And so I'm not a huge advocate for these mats that you put liquid into, nor am I an advocate for using liquid foot baths. I would recommend either some type of a product that's going to have a shelf life of at least a week that you can put into one of these pump sprayers, such as shown in the photo. That's just a weed sprayer that you can get at Walmart or Home Depot. You can mix up some disinfectant there and spray your footwear as you're walking into a facility. You can also use aerosol cans or some type of a powder in a foot pan, and it's going to be a little bit easier to implement and remember to use it as you're starting your biosecurity program. Fomites, I wanted to just touch on these because this is a huge part of entryway control that I think we take for granted. So the reason that we disinfect our footwear as we walk into the facility is because you potentially walked through an area where wild rabbits were able to pass through, or other animals that were in contact with wild rabbits have also passed through. And so you have the potential to be horizontally transferring those pathogens from the outside area into your barn. But, you know, if you are cleaning your barn out and you take a wheelbarrow outside and then you need to dump it and bring it back in, you've virtually done the same exact thing. And so that wheelbarrow needs to be disinfected again every time you walk back into the facility. So this is a photo of my barn actually, and you can see too, what have we always done as rabbit breeders? Common practice is we will disinfect cages outside and let them sit in the sun, disinfect nest boxes outside and let them sit out in the sun to dry. Well, these are all practices that we need to start thinking twice about, because this is not something that falls in line with a biosecurity program. So anything that's outside needs to be intensively cleaned and disinfected before it's brought in, more so if you're at a higher risk level on any particular time throughout the year. But we can't be taking this stuff for granted anymore. This is all pretty important, where we need to have procedures in place and understand the cleaning and disinfection process in a little bit more detail to make sure that we're not just transferring pathogens from the outside into the rabbitry. I've gotten a few questions about this, but along with this, your dogs and cats and other animals can also be fomites, and so they can transfer pathogens from the outdoors into the facility. So if you start to get into a moderate to high risk level where RHDV2 is approaching you, you probably should stop allowing your dog or cats or any other type of animal to be inside your rabbitry, but also have access to anywhere that wild animals could also have access. So we need to be super mindful of that and careful. I know there's a lot of people that can be challenging for, which is where really you need to think about implementing that when you start to get to a moderate or a higher risk level. And what we do know about RHDV2 is it has a relatively short incubation period, but it can remain on surfaces and equipment for several months. If you're in a moderate to high risk level, I really wouldn't recommend using or purchasing used rabbit equipment. But if you can confidently and intensively clean and disinfect something, that's definitely necessary before bringing any type of new equipment into the facility or anything like that. And definitely do your best not to purchase hay or equipment from any RHDV2 infected area. So along with that, there's a lot of text on this slide, and I've just put some definitions on here that are extremely important. And so it's a bit of housekeeping, but I think it's very important that everybody really understands this as we start to talk about what cleaning and disinfection actually is supposed to look like, the correct way to do it, and how to select products for cleaning and disinfection. So to start out, we'll go over how things are described on their product label. So anything that you see that's referred to as a detergent, a soap, a cleaner, a hygiene product, these are all unregulated terms. So it means that the product's not registered through the Environmental Protection Agency or EPA. So that means that these products are intended for soil removal, but they do not have claims on their labels supporting any type of microorganism kill or virus inactivation. So these are really good products to use in the cleaning step of cleaning and disinfection, but they're not going to inactivate viruses or kill microorganisms. So really being mindful of what we're using and looking at that label and how that product is described. So if you see the word disinfectant on a label, that means that it is an EPA registered product. And so that means the product has been proven to kill microorganisms at a 6-log reduction, and usually associated with a contact time of 10 minutes. And we'll talk about contact time in a minute, because that was one of the misconceptions that we heard about at the beginning of the presentation. So 6-log reduction disinfectant, EPA registered product. Sanitizer is also an EPA regulated term. That basically means a 3-log reduction in microorganisms. And so that's 99.9%. So 3 logs versus 6-log reduction is an EPA regulated term. I use both sanitizers and disinfectants in my rabbitry, and a lot of us do around our house as well anyways. The contact time can vary for sanitizers. It's common to see maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, sometimes down to 3 minutes. You just really need to look at the label. So we heard about some people on social media talking about foot pans and how they're worthless unless you stand in them for the full 10 minutes and what that means. So let's go into that a bit. When we're talking about EPA regulated products, there's a lot of data that's generated to support any type of virus inactivation or any type of bacteria or pathogen kill. So what we're looking at here is the contact time is going to be the amount of time that's associated with the log reduction that is being claimed as far as efficacy on that label. So there has to be a time requirement because we're talking about data. So basically, the ideal world, an ideal situation is that you're going to leave that disinfectant on a surface for the contact time that's associated with that product. So say 10 minutes to achieve the full 6-log pathogen reduction. If the disinfectant is not remaining on that surface for the full contact time, it does not mean that we are not achieving virus inactivation or pathogen reduction. We're just not getting to that disinfection level. And so the other idea surrounding this, or the way that we talk about using foot baths or footwear disinfection steps, is that the whole idea of stepping through a foot bath is that you are getting that product onto your footwear, and it's not just coming off of your footwear immediately. There's still product on your footwear as you step out of that foot pan. So that, applies whether you're spraying an aerosol onto your footwear, if you're walking through a powdered foot bath, if you're walking through a liquid foot bath. It really does apply to all those scenarios. And so yes, in an ideal world, maybe we would stand in a foot bath for 10 minutes and be rest assured that, we've had that full contact time, but that's not practical in most scenarios. And so the whole idea here is that it's not an ineffective practice if you're not standing in the foot pan for 10 minutes. You're doing a whole lot of good as far as pathogen reduction and getting a good coating of that disinfectant onto your footwear as you're walking into the Rabbitry. So just when you thought you knew all about how to properly clean things, I bet you didn't know there's actually this many steps in a proper cleaning and disinfection process. In food processing, there are even more steps than this because it involves a lot of verification and also application of a sanitizer after the disinfectant even. But this is typically what I recommend as far as C&D steps in livestock production settings. So I understand that this is not going to be the practical case, and this is not what we're going to do every single time that we're cleaning a piece of equipment in the Rabbitry, because it's a lot of work, and yes, it does take some time. But it is important for everyone to understand the right way to do proper sanitation and what those steps are and what the best practice is, because you are not ever going to achieve 6-log pathogen reduction or true disinfection if you're not doing all of these other steps before applying your disinfectant. So if your Rabbitry does break with RHDV, or if it gets close to you and you're in a high risk level of your biosecurity program, it's pretty important to understand how to do these steps correctly so that you can help reduce your risk. So the first step is always going to be to dry clean. So we're picking stuff up, we're sweeping, we're manually removing soil from surfaces. Maybe you're scraping off cages if you're disinfecting cages, something like that. Then you're going to wet clean. This a lot of times has to do with a pressure washer potentially. Maybe you're just pre-rinsing and applying a detergent. The detergent's going to help you chemically remove some additional soil that you weren't able to get rid of with the dry cleaning step. Then after you wet clean and apply that detergent, let that detergent sit for a bit, then you're going to rinse it off and rinse away a lot of that excess soil with that rinse step. So hopefully visually you've got a pretty clean item or piece of equipment that you're trying to disinfect at this point. You always want to make sure that the surfaces have been allowed to drain and dry before you're applying the disinfectant, because you don't want to apply disinfectant to standing water or pooled water because you're going to over dilute it and make it less effective. So once you've determined that surfaces have drained and dried enough and they're visually clean from soil, then you can apply your disinfectant and allow it to sit for the appropriate contact time. Some people will rinse the disinfectant afterwards. Sometimes you choose not to. A lot of it depends on the quality of your water and the risk of contaminating that equipment again if you've got poor water quality. So those are the full steps of the cleaning process. And again, it's not going to be practical every time you're disinfecting something, but it's important to understand the right steps so you can do it correctly when you need to. I'm also going to mention here, I have seen on Facebook a lot of people talking about disinfecting their yards. And I just want to mention that you can't unfortunately disinfect your yard or the dirt that is organic matter, and it's going to rapidly inactivate any chemicals that you put out onto it. So please, please, please don't buy expensive disinfectants and try to spray your yard, because it's a very large waste of money. So got into this a little bit earlier, but now that we've talked about the C&D process, obviously there are a lot of different products that you can use for disinfection. And so I'm going to go over just a couple slides to help give you some ideas of, well, maybe it's one slide, but a couple slides to give you some ideas of how to select those products to use. So as I mentioned before, RHDV2 is a non-enveloped virus, and so it is a little bit more challenging. You can see where it falls on this triangle of most resistant to most susceptible, as far as susceptibility of microorganisms to disinfectants. And it's kind of there on the high end, around the middle. I think we've all probably heard of some of the parvoviruses. They're notoriously difficult to inactivate. Coccidia, we do a lot of preventative work on there because it can be so challenging to battle it as far as with disinfectants. But we're sitting there in that non-enveloped virus category. If you want to compare this to something, high path avian influenza, as well as coronavirus, are both enveloped viruses, and so they are a bit easier to inactivate than RHDV2. Additionally, as I mentioned previously, there's a lot of different classes of chemical disinfectants out there, and they all have their own strengths and weaknesses. At the end of the presentation, I've got a resources slide that has some websites where you can get more information about that. But really reading your product label is going to be the key here, and looking for those EPA registered disinfectants and sanitizers that have pathogens on the label, or at least some other caliciviruses potentially. That's a really good place to look, or using the USDA's guidance on types of products that have certain active ingredients that there is data supporting inactivation of RHDV2. And I mentioned reading product labels, and so this is a really excellent resource from the Center for Food Security and Public Health. It's basically an example of a product label, and it tells you where to look to find the information that you need. So product labels can be very overwhelming. But really, if you're looking, you want to look for that EPA registration number, and that's going to give you some good indication that this is a product that's got proven efficacy. And then you can look in this other section here on the right-hand side, where you can find some of the different pathogens or organisms that the product has demonstrated efficacy against. So all of that should be right on the label. And that's a really good place to start looking as you're determining what you should and shouldn't use in your biosecurity program. All right, so rodent control and fly control in their own rights could be an entire presentation to themselves, but I'm gonna try and cover this at a level that gives people enough information where they can really start to implement an effective program if they have challenges with either of these pests. So if we didn't mention it before, rodents and flies have been proven to horizontally transfer and vector a lot of different disease pathogens. And so this is a really substantial risk because they both fit through small spaces and can get into your rabbitry from the outside. So being mindful of that and really implementing rodent control and fly control programs is a huge, huge piece of biosecurity. A lot of times in poultry production, this can be the weakest link in a program. So we really, really want to make sure that we're understanding what we need to do and implementing the measures that we can. So first step is always identification, because the type of rodent or pest that you're dealing with is going to affect how you approach your pest control scenario or program. So here we've got a picture, 2 photos of a mouse, and I think most of us are familiar with what mice look like, but they've got kind of that more rounded face, bigger ears. They're small. You know, we see them a lot. Well, they can be throughout a facility, but Generally, they've got about a 30-foot range that's going to be their territory, and they're going to stay within that range. You know, they make nests in various places with different debris or insulation that they can find, whatever it may be. And then when we start to look at rats, we've got these others. And so this Norway rat in the middle, these can get huge. They like lower spaces. And so these are the ones that you're finding any type of burrows around concrete pads or foundations going underneath. They like to burrow into the ground. They'll also go into wall voids and things like that to make nests as well, or for harborage. They can have a much larger range, up to about 350 feet of territory. And then in comparison, we've got this roof rat here, which the roof rats have a little bit longer tails. They're primarily just found in much warmer climates. So for example, here in Texas, we see these the most towards East Texas, or at least the eastern half of the state. There's higher humidity levels, but as the name suggests, these are the rats that prefer to nest in your attic, and they prefer to be up in rafters. They like to be higher up. And so when we start to think about those differences, that's definitely going to affect how we're baiting these, or how we're going to try and manage these pests. Step 2 is always to do a deep investigation. So once you've ID'd the type of pest or rodent that you have at your property, you're really going to dig in and start to play detective and try to figure out what they're using for their 3 critical needs. So all of the rodents have 3 critical needs: their food, water, and harborage or shelter. Mice actually have much lower water requirements than rats because they can get all the moisture they need just from the food that they eat. So, but rodents, you're definitely going to need some type of a water source, and that's going to attract them. So you want to identify where are they getting their food, where are they getting their water, and what are they using for harborage. So you can try and eliminate any of those if at all possible, or at least reduce those. So I guess along with this piece, obviously some of this is going to be very challenging as rabbit breeders. All of our rabbits are super messy eaters. They do not consume all of the feed in their feeder. They like to throw it everywhere. So that can be challenging, but we need to do the best we can to try and manage any type of feed spills and things like that. So when we start to get into our action that we're going to take, now that we've done our investigation and we kind of have an idea of the species that we're dealing with, where they're harboring, where they're getting their food, and especially their water source. So then we can start to put an action plan together. You want to remove any areas you can, as I said, block holes, clean up spilled feed. And then I think hopefully most people are kind of familiar with this little black box. They're called bait stations, and you see them, you'll probably start to see them everywhere now that I've mentioned it, but you see them a lot at like zoos, businesses. We have them all over in the South. But these are used to put bait into so that it's protected from, say, your dog can't reach it necessarily. Any non-target animal isn't going to be able to get into this box. Additionally, you know, hopefully your kids aren't going into these boxes either to have access to the bait, but that's the purpose. They make some pretty fancy bait stations nowadays that actually you can open them with your feet even, and then some of them have like cement blocks in them, so they're weighted down and you don't have to worry about in a dog playing with it and knocking it out of place or anything like that, or even a storm blowing it away. So the key here is that if you've got a rodent program or problem, you want to put these bait stations about every 20 to 25 feet, but the type of pest that you have can affect where you're going to put these. So we put them around the outside perimeter of a lot of buildings if we've got Norway rat problems, but also maybe put a few inside the rabbitry, particularly near any water source that might be an attractive area for rats, especially. If you've got roof rats as your primary pest at your facility, then you're going to start to think about potentially building a couple little shelves to put bait stations on higher up in the rafters in areas where those roof rats are going to much prefer versus the ground. So understanding the pests that you have, and most commonly you do have one primary species of pests at your facility. It's less likely that you have multiple species, but it can happen. So really cater your rodent control program and rodenticide applications to the type of rodent that you're targeting. And with that, a couple notes about bait stations in general is that you should always wear gloves when you're handling bait. Rats are pretty intuitive, and if they smell humans on their bait because you baited your stations with bare hands, they're not going to want to eat that bait. And especially tobacco users, if you don't wear gloves and they smell the tobacco, they'll be very deterred from eating the bait. So you want to make sure you wear gloves and refill those stations every 2 to 4 weeks. You want to clean them out and wash them every few months. Rodents do have hierarchies, and so there are alphas, betas, and omegas in all of the populations. The alphas get, the best harborage areas and best feed sources. If an alpha has urinated inside of that bait station, that means that the omegas and betas will not enter that bait station unless it's washed out. So you can effectively remove your alphas from the population, but you're still going to have the betas and omegas, and the alphas will get repopulated. So really targeting all of those areas by keeping those bait stations baited, but then washed out effectively can help you get the whole population under control. There are a lot of different forms of rodenticides that you can find, and we'll talk about where to buy these from in a moment. But I really recommend these soft baits and the block baits. The holes in the block baits fit onto bars inside your bait stations, and so it's really nice and ensures that the bait's not going to fall out of there. Soft baits, you just put them right through those metal bars that are inside the bait stations, and that secures them in there as well. If you've got a lot of Norway rats with a lot of deep burrows, you can buy meal baits and bait those burrows with a PVC pipe to get the bait down into where the rats are, but it's also not in an area where anyone or a dog's going to come into contact with that or any non-target pests, and so that is something that you can also do as well. These are a couple products that I use in my program, and I definitely recommend them. They're used for commercial pest control, so they're highly effective products. You can get these at stores like Atwood's, Tractor Supply. Sometimes you might need to ask for them to special order it in, but they are both available on Amazon as well. And the key here is that there are different active ingredients in different types of baits. There's also different companies that have different types of baits as well. But reading what that active ingredient is and making sure that you do rotate it at different times so you're not getting any type of resistance occurring is important. And so one of these 9-pound pails, if you're putting bait stations every 20 to 25 feet, for most people, it is going to last you about 6 months. And so it's kind of nice if you just rotate, try to do 2 different baits throughout a 1-year period, and that should be really effective. Fly control. So same thing here. This could be a whole presentation on its own, but I'm going to hit the highlights, and certainly people that have additional questions can ask that after the presentation. But when we talk about fly control, we're really looking at filth flies. And so there's a lot of different species of filth flies. It's kind of a general term referring to various species that prefer to reproduce and in decomposing matter, garbage, carrion, vegetation, and manure. So obviously we have a lot of all of those things in our rabbitries. So rabbits do produce manure, and so I guess there's 2 different types of fly groups that can be filth flies, and so we've got the ones that there's a couple exceptions that do feed on blood, but those are still considered filth flies because they are their preference is still to reproduce in decaying material or manure. And so just like with rodent control, step one is always going to be identification, because it does affect what our management strategy is going to be. So here I've got, there are more species of filth flies than this, but here are 3 really common ones that you'll run into, and you're probably already recognizing these just from the photos. But the common house fly is in that first picture there. And then we've got a bottle fly. These can be green. There's, well, this is a blue bottle fly. There's green bottle flies as well, and other colors. And then the stable fly is a picture down below. And so flesh fly is another one of the biting flies that's considered a filth fly. But you can see here that this stable fly has different mouth parts than the other flies. And so, you know, he's going to have biting, sucking mouth parts, and that's how they take their blood meal. But they're not going to be attracted to the same type of scents and food sources. They're going to be attracted to live animals that they can take a blood meal from. And so that affects our management strategy. And we mentioned this earlier, but flies, particularly, there's been a lot of research conducted on the housefly, and it's been associated with more than 100 different food safety and disease pathogens, and transferring those to different surfaces. That is highly because of the fact that they are attracted to decaying matter and garbage and manure and things like that, but then they also land on other surfaces. So there can be a lot of pathogen transfer there, and obviously they're very small, and they can go from the outside of your rabbitry and then come in and bring pathogens along with them. So we'll talk a little bit about fly biology just at a high level as it pertains to management. So some keys here, especially when we talk about houseflies in particular, in ideal conditions, as far as temperature and humidity levels, they can go through their entire life cycle from egg to adult within 5 days if conditions are ideal. Usually we see this as a range of like 5 to 10 days, but if we start to think about that, people who have rabbitry setups where you're dumping trays or you're cleaning out solid bottom cages or anything like that, a lot of us clean the cages out once a week. That's good practice, but sometimes that's not even enough if the whole life cycle can be completed in 5 days. So when we're talking about those high risk times of our biosecurity program, being really mindful of manure management and how this fly life cycle can be affected by that. Also, at any given time at your rabbitry, 80% of your total fly population is in the egg, larval, or pupal stage of this life cycle, and only 20% are adults. And so if our entire fly control program is only focusing on knocking down adult flies, but it's not focused on targeting larval stages or manure management, then we're missing a huge, enormous portion of that population, and it's unlikely that your program is going to be super effective. So we want to make sure we're being mindful of all of the stages of the fly life cycle when we're looking at having a successful program. So investigate is step 2, just like rodent control. We want to find the breeding sites. Guess what? It's probably your manure pile or wherever your manure is. But really understand the life cycle at your facility and where those flies are breeding. Potentially if you've got trash piled up somewhere or a bunch of decaying matter in a ditch nearby your rabbitry. Different scenarios like that, you want to investigate and identify those so you can remove any type of breeding site that you possibly can. Obviously in hanging cage systems, if you're not routinely cleaning out underneath the hanging cages, there can be some challenges associated with that. My suggestion there is that I don't think I've got it in the slides, but there is an ideal percentage of moisture that flies do need to reproduce. And so when we're looking at more humid climates, it's going to be more challenging, but you know, it's around that 60 to 80% moisture range is really going to be ideal. And so if you can keep your trays or your manure underneath your cages to try and get that to be drier somehow, that is going to help with your fly control strategies. We want to make sure, again, that we're cleaning up excess feed and waste, that we're emptying trash bins. If you have other livestock on your property or your neighbor's property, that can be challenging as well, and attracting different types of flies even. We can't always do everything about that, but it can help us understand what we need to do as far as our management strategies. If your facility is not enclosed, if you can install netting or potentially look at trying to somewhat enclose that, the more you can do, the better off you're going to be. Non-chemical interventions, such as the things that I've just mentioned, can really be the most important step in control. Obviously, there are chemicals that we can apply as well that are effective, but we really need to look at integrated pest management and the whole picture if you want to be successful. Step 3 is action. Like I mentioned earlier, you might want to adjust your manure management practices at different times of year, or if you're in a higher risk state. To reduce the breeding sites, you want to look at, there's a lot of different options of things that we can use. I'm actually a huge advocate for fly predators in rabbitry scenarios because generally speaking, it's a small enough production setting where you can get some good success relatively easily with that. And I'll talk more about those in a minute. Fly baits. This is where the identification of the type of fly that you have is really going to make a difference, because fly baits work really good for house flies or bottle flies, for example. They're not going to work for any of your blood feeding flies or biting flies. So understanding what type of flies you have is going to be the key to understanding what you're using to get rid of them. And then this Country Vet automatic spray system, those are really popular in rabbitries, and it's a great product. I think that's a good tool to use in a biosecurity program, but it's not the only tool you should be using. These are some additional products that really easy to get a hold of that you can use in your program. And I'll just make a note that just like with disinfectants, you always want to be reading your product labels and looking at what that specific product is labeled for. But I can say that if you're finding products that have pyrethrins as their active ingredient, a lot of times they will have on or over animal approved language on the label, where if that gets sprayed in a rabbitry while rabbits are in the rabbitry, it's not necessarily going to have negative effects. So you want to always read the specific product label, but that's something that I look for a lot when I'm looking for products to apply, especially inside the rabbitry. Make sure that you are using chemical insecticides in different areas than where you are releasing your fly predators if you're choosing to use fly predators in your program. So obviously fly predators will be susceptible to insecticides as well. Speaking of which, so this is just a slide about parasitoid biology. We hear about fly predators a lot, and there's several companies that sell them. Spalding Labs is one of them. So what is unique about these parasitoids is they're very, very tiny. But if we're looking at this life cycle here, you see the fly lays the eggs and there's a larva, and then that larva pupates, and the pupal stage is where it starts to morph into an adult. Well, in that pupal stage, that's where these fly predators or parasitoids actually lay their eggs into the pupal stage of the fly, and then their larvae hatch and eat that fly. And then out of the pupa, instead of an adult housefly, for example, emerges additional fly predators or parasitoids. And so it's a very unique life cycle, and it's interesting because the people who sell these fly predators can actually ship you a package when the parasitoids are inside that pupal stage developing. And so when they start to emerge out of the pupae, the fly pupae in the package is when you want to release those on your property or in your rabbitry or on your manure pile. And I'll have a picture of that in a minute. Some recommendations as far as applying these. The key here, if you want it to be successful, is that you do need to get on top of this early in the season. And if you've already got a huge fly problem, it's going to be harder to gain control once that problem's already out of control. So there's some recommendations based on the zone that you fall into in the US. And if you're further south, you've got a longer fly season. It is what it is. If you're further north, you've got a shorter fly season. But the recommendation is releasing fly predators every 2 to 4 weeks. You can go onto their websites online and enter in the number of animals that you have, and they'll generate how many packages you need and give you recommendations on how frequently. Basically, they create the program for you. But as it works out for my facility, and I'm down in Texas, it costs me about $20 a month for the amount of rabbits that I have, and that's just per month until I don't need to use them anymore. So I do use them at my facility, and they are effective. This is what the packaging looks like when you order these, and I mentioned this earlier, but you wait for the parasitoids to start to emerge before you put these out on your property. And the circle there is showing one of the fly parasitoids emerging. And so you can see they're very, very tiny compared to the fly pupae. So that's what you're looking for. And then it's time to open up the packages and release them wherever you think the flies are breeding at your property. That's fly control high level. If people have additional questions, I could talk about that for hours, but you can email or ask them at the end of the presentation. I just have one slide on water quality because this is an important piece of biosecurity that we often overlook. But water attracts other species of animals that can transfer pathogens just like flies. There's cockroaches, especially in the south. I've got this photo here of a dead rodent in a crock, and I just wanted to make a comment that if you do use crocks, it's difficult to have good biosecurity because you are going to be attracting pests like this that also have water requirements. And obviously, if they are drinking and sharing water with your rabbits, it's an easy way to transfer pathogens. So just be mindful of that. Not saying that can't happen in enclosed systems as well, but it is less common. So biosecurity best practices would be to try to have some type of an automatic or tubing water system or water bottles. But obviously that needs to be disinfected on a regular basis, or replace the tubing. And have a procedure for that as well, because any type of water system can become contaminated. I just added a quick note in here about quarantine. This is being recommended, and it's going to be a struggle for a lot of people, but I'll make a couple comments on it. So one of the National Poultry Improvement Plan principles does pertain to replacement animals and procedures associated with replacement animals. And if you're going to have a true quarantine, really any animal that leaves your facility needs to return again, such as going to a show, should be quarantined, because you don't know what they've come into contact with, especially if you took them to a show. And you don't necessarily want to introduce that to your whole herd. But again, that's the risk that you're willing to assume. So ideally, everyone would have a separate facility, or separate, very separated, defined room where you're going to have potentially your show animals and then your breeding stock. The more separated that those are, the better off you're going to be, as again, it allows you to have more layers of protection between those two areas. But a true quarantine is going to be for really 14 days would be pretty acceptable. I've seen some other groups recommending 30 days. The incubation period for our RHDV2 is quite short, and so I would feel comfortable with 14 days and personally, but really it's all about having a separate area for any animals leaving the facility and then coming back, or any replacement stock that you're purchasing that's coming in. So, to reiterate and address some of the misconceptions about how expensive biosecurity really can be, we talked about some costs for different programs and things like that. And I have another slide that details that out again. But there's a lot of a lot of text on this slide, and that's because there are a lot of things that we can do that are not going to cost money. And so a lot of it is just cleanliness and sanitation practices, clean up trash, adjust your manure management strategies, clean up spilled feed, sweep your barn, do the things that you need to do to try to limit your pest pressures. We can limit visitors, designate separate footwear for outside versus inside. I mean, you can buy a new pair of boots if you want to, but I'm sure people have something already that they can use, and just really designate indoor and outdoor footwear. That can go a long way. Your choices on whether you're taking your rabbits to shows or not, creating a quarantine area if you have the facilities already to do so, that can be inexpensive. Changing clothes or showering after handling other rabbits or being in areas where wild rabbits may live. You know, people who go to judge a show, making sure that you're not judging a show, coming home and going straight into your barn. Obviously, best practice would be to wash your clothes and take a shower before you're entering an area where your own animals are. Training your family and making sure everybody is complying. Avoid feeding hay that's from affected areas. And all of these things really are management practices that we can all start implementing that are not going to be super expensive. Here are some additional things that I touched on with some pricing that I just grabbed offline that most people should be able to purchase products for. You know, fly predators, $20 to $25 per month. Bait stations, initial upfront cost might be a bit because they're about $15 each, but they last a very, very long time. And after that, all you need to purchase is bait, which could be about $10 a month, especially during heavy pest pressure times. You might choose to do residual perimeter sprays for insects. Those are available. You can do that to control spiders, cockroaches, ants, in addition to flies and other insects as well. Aerosol sprays, if you want to get the cans, they're about $15 for a 25-ounce can. You can get a pair of rubber boots for $12. You can get disposable boot covers for $15 a box. Different disinfectants, you know, you can use bleach for things as long as you're pre-cleaning before you apply it. And then Virkon S, Rescue, those are products that have been proven effective against RHDV2, at least through some university studies at this point, and they're being recommended by USDA. So really looking here to start implementing a program, you can do it for $50, maybe even less, just to start and get some basic measures in place. Obviously, your costs will increase as you add more layers, but as I mentioned, putting your program together with low risk, moderate risk, and high risk levels can help you manage those costs. Where do I purchase biosecurity products? I just have a couple slides on this because somebody did want some of this information, but they're out there and they're very accessible. I was quite surprised entering some information onto Amazon, what all popped up. For a while, we were running into a lot of out of stock on Amazon, but I just screenshotted some of this stuff yesterday and it is in stock. So you can get Rescue wipes on Amazon. You can get Rescue RTU. Concentrate was back ordered yesterday, but that's available as well in that form. You can get products from NASCO Farm Supply. You can get rodent bait on Amazon now. It's like you can get everything on Amazon these days. And Do My Own Pest Control is a really excellent resource where you can get commercial grade products or really good products that are very effective for insect control as well as some rodent control. And so that's a really good resource that I use all the time. So these are just some additional places. I mentioned Spalding is one of the companies that sells fly predators. QC Supply is a supplier for poultry and swine supplies. They've got a lot of biosecurity products. You can get stuff at Tractor Supply, Atwoods, whatever your local farm store is, and Do My Own. To wrap up here, Some best practices really get started today. Everyone can start to implement something. And if we are thinking about this logically and using some of the tools that I covered today in the presentation, I hope everyone really is starting to generate some ideas on how this can apply to you in your rabbitry and your current situation. So thinking about a program logically and starting to implement the 3 tiers or risk levels is really going to help you understand what biosecurity programs can cost and how you start to implement that where you live. Continuing to reevaluate your risk level throughout the year, right? We talked about that flow chart. That's going to change depending on the season and what the current status is of RHDV2 in your state or your area. So thinking about that throughout the year and adjusting your program as necessary. There's a lot of really good templates from the poultry industry that we can use as a guide to get started and creating a more simplified program that applies to our facility that's scalable. I talked about knowing your limits and understanding how far you're willing to go and what amount of risk you're willing to assume to protect your animals. And I think everyone needs to have that conversation with themselves and really understand where they sit and what their threshold is going to be. That's going to allow you to budget appropriately, but also there's a consideration of the responsibility we have to protect our own animals, but also the animals of others that live in surrounding areas. So key here, don't panic, think logically. There's a lot of resources out there. You can continue to educate yourself and come up with new ideas and innovations on how to protect your herd. Just a note about compliance, right? A good biosecurity program is only effective if there is understanding, agreement, and compliance and buy-in from every person in the family, every person that enters your rabbitry, including your hired help and any visitors that you might allow on site. So this is really important. If you can't get everyone to agree and buy into the program and doing entryway control and things like that, you're really probably wasting some money by putting these practices in place, because like I mentioned, you're only as strong as your weakest link, and you really need to have agreement and buy-in and understanding from everyone that's going to enter the rabbitry for this to work. And so it's really important. I would definitely recommend getting signage. You can buy biosecurity signage for $10. You can get that on Amazon too. But sometimes it's just a matter of having a reminder there, especially when you start to implement a new habit where it's a reminder that people don't forget to spray their footwear or sanitize their hands or change their footwear, whatever it might be. But signage can really help with that. I once heard a veterinarian say that if your program isn't inconvenient, then you aren't doing enough. And I thought this was a really powerful statement because it's so true. People kind of cringe sometimes when they hear about biosecurity, because especially if you're used to not doing anything, it is going to be a horrible pain and everyone's going to be frustrated with it and no one's going to want to do it. And the more protected you are, the more of a pain your program is, and it's going to add time to chores, and it's just a necessary evil. But it's, something that's going to be painful at first for everybody. But eventually it should become second nature. And then, we start to just do it out of habit. And if everyone takes the appropriate precautions, then we're all going to be able to work together and be a lot more effective at controlling disease outbreaks across the country. These are some of the resources that I talked about. The USDA has really good information on their website. I think a lot of people on the Facebook groups have been following that pretty closely. But also the Iowa Poultry Association has some really good resources, including biosecurity product spreadsheet that I had helped put together. It's really focused on poultry industry, but it's got a lot of good information on it and talks about products that are EPA registered versus not and things like that. So that's available for people to access online. There's also the National Poultry Improvement Plan Biosecurity Program template. It's actually laid out like a really nice PDF workbook, and it kind of step-by-step helps you build out a program. There may be some sections that are less relevant that you'll choose to not necessarily include, but that's a really good place to go to get started. And then Center for Food Security and Public Health has a disinfection protocol, talks about proper C&D. It has some information about viruses and bacteria and characteristics of disinfectants and other resources similar to that product label sample that I had shown in a previous slide. This is what that biosecurity program product evaluation spreadsheet looks like. It's just a snapshot. You can go to that website if you want to see the full thing. And that's all that I have. So if there's any questions, I can try to answer some of those now.
Thank you so much, Paula. This presentation has definitely been great. There's tons and tons of information on ways that producers can, or breeders can protect their operations. There are a couple questions that have came up. The first one is from Jennifer. She says, if you have a barn cat to keep mice and rodents out of the barn and feed, what is riskier, cats or allowing the rodents?
Yeah, so I actually deal with this question sometimes at work as well, but it really depends on what your setup looks like. And if that cat is just staying in the barn, it obviously is better to have the cat in the barn. We're most concerned about cats that have free range and they can go outside and might be in contact with wild rabbits, but then also come into the rabbitry. You know, barn cats don't really distinguish between wild rabbits and rodents a lot of times. And so that obviously would be an issue if your barn cat is killing a wild rabbit or being around wild rabbits and then coming back in the barn. And so in that instance, I really would, if it was my facility, if I was getting to that higher risk level, I would exclude the barn cat from the rabbitry area and put in other rodent control methods such as bait stations.
Okay. Another question was on the when you were talking about having a spray, like the water bottle spray can next to the or in the rabbitry on your in the dirty area. Does the Walmart water spray bottle actually have good coverage compared to foot baths? So the question really alludes to, like, are foot baths better or the spray container like that you recommended?
Well, that really depends on the user then. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I've seen people use aerosol spray cans or the weed sprayer and not do a great job of lifting their boot up and spraying the whole bottom. But that's really up to you. I mean, I would say I still think it's going to be more effective than using a liquid foot bath if you're not managing the liquid foot bath appropriately. And by that, I mean, at least every single day it gets remixed and fresh chemical gets put in it. People kind of think that sounds easy, but you would not believe how many people skip it over. And when some of the high path avian influenza outbreaks happened back in 2016, for example, there was some research done where they actually were testing the liquid foot baths and they had become a huge point of contamination instead of cleanliness because they weren't getting routinely cleaned out and remixed and properly managed. So that's all about you and your decisions at your facility and what you're going to commit to doing and how long you're willing to, or if you're willing to spray the bottom of your footwear with an aerosol can and make sure you get the whole boot.
And the final question we have is from Megan. She says, our pigs and rabbits are in the same barn. There's not much room for fly traps and rat poison and stuff like that. Is there anything else that would work?
So if you've got both in your barn, chances are you probably should try and find space to be doing and implementing those programs. But like I mentioned, if you've got some rodents, like a lot of people will put the majority of their bait stations and things outside around the perimeter of the barn, and that can be super effective if you don't have room inside. And then as far as fly control, even the country vet sprayers, they can hang on the wall and stuff. So there are different things you can implement but another management tool could be to hang fly traps and bait stations outside as well.
Okay. That concludes all the questions. Like I said, I greatly appreciate you coming on tonight and educating everybody on developing and implementing a biosecurity plan for your rabbitry. Thank you so much, Paula.
Yeah, thanks, David.